Clara's days were a blur of activity, each one blending into the next like colors on a damp canvas. At just 24 years old, she carried the weight of responsibilities far beyond her age, juggling work and family with an unrelenting determination that left little room for rest. Her mornings began before sunrise, when most people were still tucked away in their warm beds, dreaming of vacations or weekend plans. For Clara, there was no time for such luxuries. She lived in a small, rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city, sharing the cramped space with her younger brother Danny, who had fallen ill over a year ago. Their lives were far from easy, but Clara refused to let despair take hold. Every morning, after making sure Danny had taken his medicine and eaten something, even if it was just a piece of toast, Clara would step out into the chilly air, walking briskly toward the diner where she worked. The streets were alive with the sounds of cars honking and people rushing to catch buses or taxis, all trying to get somewhere important. But Clara didn't have big dreams anymore. Or rather, she did. But they weren't about herself. Her dreams now revolved around keeping Danny healthy, paying off their mounting medical bills, and maybe someday finding a way to give him the life he deserved. The diner was nothing fancy, a cozy little place tucked between a laundromat and a hardware store. Its windows were smudged with fingerprints, and the neon sign outside flickered whenever the wind picked up. Inside, the walls were lined with faded posters advertising pies and milkshakes, while mismatched chairs scraped against the tiled floor as customers came and went. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, or at least part of them. Clara worked long hours, serving coffee to tired commuters, taking orders from families with cranky toddlers, and cleaning up spills left behind by careless patrons. She never complained, though. Instead, she greeted everyone with a smile, even when her feet ached and her stomach growled because she hadn't had time to eat. What set Clara apart from the other waitresses wasn't her efficiency or her ability to remember complicated orders. It was her kindness. People noticed it immediately. Whether it was offering a kind word to a stressed-out mother or sneaking an extra scoop of ice cream onto a child's sundae, Clara had a way of making people feel seen, and that mattered more to her than anything else. In a world that often felt cold and indifferent, she believed in the power of small gestures. A smile here, a compliment there. It didn't cost much, but it could make someone's day brighter. On this particular evening, the diner was, quieter than usual. The snowstorm brewing outside kept many people indoors, and only a handful of customers lingered at the tables. Clara moved between them, refilling cups of coffee and clearing plates, her movements steady and practiced. But despite the calm atmosphere, something caught her attention. In the corner of the room, near the window overlooking the street, sat a young boy who looked completely out of place. He couldn't have been older than 8 or 9, dressed in clothes that seemed too large for his slender frame. His dark hair stuck out in messy tufts, and his wide eyes stared blankly at the swirling snowflakes outside. At first, Clara thought he might be waiting for his parents, perhaps enjoying a rare treat of pie and hot chocolate during a family outing. But as the minutes ticked by, she realized he wasn't eating. His untouched menu lay flat on the table, and the fork beside his plate hadn't been touched. Something about him tugged at her heartstrings. There was a loneliness in his posture, a heaviness in the way he slouched in his chair, as if carrying a burden too great for someone so young. Curiosity and concern gnawed at Clara. After checking on her other customers, she approached the boy cautiously, not wanting to startle him. "Hi there," she said softly, leaning down slightly to meet his gaze. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" The boy blinked up at her, startled, as if he hadn't noticed her presence until now. For a moment, he hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the zipper of his oversized hoodie. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he replied, "I'm fine." Clara tilted her head, studying him carefully. Experience had taught her how to read people, their expressions, their body language, and she could tell this boy wasn't fine. Still, she didn't push. Instead, she gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" she asked gently. When he shrugged indifferently, she pulled out the chair and settled into it, resting her elbows on the table. No, she began, her tone light and conversational. This is my favorite spot in the whole diner. I come here sometimes when I need a break. The view of the snow is really pretty, isn't it? The boy glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the window. I guess, he murmured. Clara smiled, undeterred by his reluctance to engage. My name's Clara. What's yours? Ethan, he mumbled after a pause. Well, Ethan, it's nice to meet you. Are you here with your family? He shook his head. No, just alone. Her heart sank at the admission, but she kept her expression neutral, unwilling to let him see how much his words affected her. How long have you been sitting here, Ethan? I don't know, he admitted. A while. Clara frowned. Do you live nearby? Is someone coming to pick you up? For the first time, Ethan turned to look at her fully, his brown eyes filled with a mixture of uncertainty and vulnerability. My dad's always busy, he said quietly. He doesn't notice me. Those simple words struck a chord deep within Clara. She knew what it was like to feel invisible, to crave attention and affection only to be met with silence or indifference. Without thinking, she reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on his. Hey, listen to me. You're not invisible, okay? Not to me, and definitely not to anyone who truly knows you. Ethan looked down at her hand covering his, then back up at her face. For a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, a spark that reminded her why she did what she did every single day. Even when life felt overwhelming, moments like these reminded her that she could still make a difference no matter how small. So, Clara said brightly, standing up and straightening her apron, how about we fix that menu situation? What do you say to some hot chocolate and maybe a slice of apple pie? On the house. Ethan hesitated, then nodded shyly. As Clara walked away to prepare his order, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was going to change something. For both of them. The diner was quieter now, the hum of conversation fading into the background as Clara returned to Ethan's table with a steaming mug of hot chocolate and a generous slice of apple pie. The rich aroma of cinnamon and caramel wafted through the air, mingling with the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee. She set the items down gently in front of him, arranging them with care, as if she were presenting a gift rather than a simple meal. Here you go, she said warmly, her voice soft but encouraging. This should warm you up. Ethan stared at the plate for a moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the mug without actually touching it. His hesitation wasn't lost on Clara. She pulled out the chair across from him again and sat down, folding her hands on the table. You know, she began casually, when I was your age, my mom used to make me hot chocolate whenever I was feeling down. It's like magic. It can turn even the worst day around. She winked playfully, hoping to coax a reaction out of him. At first, Ethan didn't respond. He simply picked up the spoon and stirred the whipped cream into the chocolate slowly, watching as the creamy swirls dissolved into the liquid below. But after a few seconds, he glanced up at her, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Why are you being so nice to me? He asked bluntly. You don't even know me. Clara chuckled softly, leaning back in her chair. Well, that's easy, she said, because everyone deserves a little kindness, especially when they're having a tough day. And besides, she paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. You remind me of someone I used to know, a kid who needed a friend once upon a time. That answer seemed to satisfy Ethan just enough to keep him talking. He took a tentative sip of the hot chocolate, his face lighting up ever so slightly at the sweet taste. It's good, he admitted quietly, almost reluctantly, as though admitting it might make him vulnerable somehow. I'm glad you like it, Clara replied, her smile widening. Then, sensing an opening, she added, So, what brings you here all by yourself? You must have quite the story. Ethan hesitated again, setting the mug down carefully before answering. My dad works late, he said finally, his voice barely audible over the low murmur of the diner. He's always working. Sometimes I wait for him, but he forgets. Clara felt a pang of sadness tug at her chest, but she masked it quickly, nodding sympathetically instead. "That must be hard," she said gently. "Waiting for someone who's busy all the time isn't fun. But hey, maybe he doesn't mean to forget. Maybe he just gets caught up in things." Ethan shrugged, his small shoulders rising and falling in a gesture that spoke volumes about how accustomed he'd grown to disappointment. "Maybe," he muttered. "But it's still lonely." Clara leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. "Loneliness is tricky," she said. "It sneaks up on you when you least expect it. But you know what helps? Finding people who understand, like friends or comic book heroes." That last part earned her a raised eyebrow from Ethan. "Comic book heroes?" he echoed skeptically. "Absolutely," Clara exclaimed, her enthusiasm genuine. "They're the best. I mean, think about Spider-Man. He's got this whole double life thing going on, saving the world while dealing with regular problems like homework and chores. Or Batman. Sure, he's got gadgets and a fancy car, but deep down, he's just a guy who lost his parents and feels alone sometimes. Sound familiar?" To her surprise, Ethan cracked a small smile. "I guess," he said, his tone lighter now. "Spider-Man's cool, I guess." "Oh, come on," Clara teased, pretending to be scandalized. "Cool. That's it? Spider-Man's amazing, don't sell him short." For the first time since she'd met him, Ethan laughed. A quiet, hesitant laugh, but a laugh nonetheless. It was a breakthrough, however small, and Clara seized the opportunity to keep the conversation flowing. Over the next half hour, they talked about everything from superheroes to school projects to favorite foods. Ethan opened up gradually, sharing bits and pieces of his life with surprising candor. He told her about his dad's frequent business trips, about how the housekeeper usually made dinner but never stayed long enough to chat, and about how much he hated sitting in the back seat of his dad's chauffeur-driven car, staring out the window at a world that felt miles away. As they talked, Clara couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between Ethan's circumstances and her own childhood. While she had grown up in modest surroundings, surrounded by love and laughter despite financial struggles, Ethan lived in luxury, but seemed starved for connection. It was a reminder of how wealth didn't guarantee happiness, and how loneliness could strike anyone regardless of their background. Eventually, the clock struck 10, signaling closing time. Clara stood reluctantly, glancing at Ethan with concern. "Hey, listen," she said, crouching beside his chair so they were eye level. "I hate to say this, but we need to close up soon. Do you think your dad will be coming to get you?" Ethan shook his head, avoiding her gaze. "Probably not tonight," he mumbled. Clara frowned, her protective instincts kicking in. "Do you live far from here?" she asked. When Ethan nodded vaguely, pointing toward the direction of the city's upscale neighborhoods, Clara made a decision. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," she said firmly. "I'll walk you home. No arguments." Ethan looked surprised, perhaps even a little embarrassed. "You don't have to do that," he protested weakly. "Yes, I do," Clara insisted, grabbing her coat from the rack near the counter. "It's freezing outside, and I'm not letting you wander off on your own. Besides, I've got nothing better to do tonight anyway." As they stepped out into the cold night air, the snow crunching beneath their feet, Clara wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck. Ethan trudged along beside her, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his oversized hoodie. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence broken only by the occasional gust of wind or the distant rumble of traffic. But as they turned onto a wide, tree-lined avenue lined with grand mansions, Ethan broke the quiet. "This is where I live," he said quietly, stopping in front of an imposing iron gate that led to a sprawling estate. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat, as she took in the sight before her. The mansion loomed majestically against the dark sky, its windows glowing warmly like golden lanterns. A uniformed security guard emerged from a nearby booth, eyeing her curiously as she stood there in her worn-out coat and scuffed boots. She felt completely out of place, like a character from one of those fairy tales where the peasant stumbles upon the palace by accident. "Well," she said finally, forcing a smile despite her discomfort. This explains why you weren't too worried about walking home alone. Ethan shrugged, looking suddenly awkward. Do you want to come inside? He offered hesitantly. It's warmer. Clara hesitated, torn between politeness and practicality. Part of her wanted to politely decline and leave things as they were, but another part, the part that had connected with Ethan over hot chocolate and comic books, urged her to stay. After all, she reasoned, she hadn't done anything wrong. She was just making sure a lonely boy got home safely. Sure, she said at last, following him through the gate and into the opulent foyer beyond. As the heavy doors closed behind them, sealing off the cold night, Clara marveled at the stark difference between Ethan's world and hers. Yet, despite the gilded surroundings, she couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was missing. A tiu, warmth, a sense of belonging that no amount of money could buy. Before leaving, Clara scribbled her phone number on a napkin and handed it to Ethan. If you ever feel lonely again, or if you just want to talk about Spider-Man, you can call me, okay? Promise? Ethan nodded, clutching the napkin tightly in his hand. For the first time that evening, he looked genuinely hopeful, as though he'd found a lifeline in the midst of his isolation. And as Clara walked back into the snowy night, she couldn't help but wonder if their paths crossing had been more than just coincidence. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Clara, her days filled with the usual grind of work, errands, and caring for Danny. Yet despite the routine, something lingered in the back of her mind. A memory of that snowy night and the boy named Ethan. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, not really. After all, what were the chances that someone like him would reach out to someone like her? But one afternoon, as she was clearing tables at the diner, the bell above the door chimed, signaling a new customer. Without looking up, Clara called out automatically, "Be right with you," before grabbing a fresh towel to wipe down the counter. When she finally turned around, her breath caught in her throat. Standing just inside the doorway, brushing snow off his coat, was Ethan. Beside him stood a tall, impeccably dressed man in his early 40s, exuding an aura of authority and sophistication. His sharp features and piercing gaze made it clear that he wasn't someone used to being ignored or waiting. Clara instinctively straightened her posture, suddenly hyper-aware of how mismatched she must look compared to them. Her apron was stained with coffee splatters, her hair tied back in a messy bun, and her shoes scuffed from countless hours on her feet. "Clara," Ethan's voice broke through her momentary panic, pulling her attention away from his companion. He looked different today, cleaner, happier even, as though some invisible weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Before she could respond, the man beside him stepped forward, extending a hand. "Miss Clara," he said, his deep voice smooth and measured. "I'm Alexander Hartwell, Ethan's father." Clara froze for a split second, her heart pounding in her chest. Alexander Hartwell. The name rang a bell. It was impossible not to recognize it. Hartwell Enterprises dominated headlines regularly, its logo appearing everywhere from skyscrapers to tech gadgets. This was one of the richest men alive, standing right here in her humble diner, shaking her hand. And yet, despite the surreal nature of the situation, Clara forced herself to focus. "Mr. Hartwell," she managed, her voice steady despite her nerves. "It's nice to meet you." Ethan tugged at his father's sleeve, excitement bubbling over as he explained animatedly. "Dad, this is the waitress I told you about. The one who helped me that night. Remember?" Alexander glanced down at his son, his expression softening ever so slightly. Then turning back to Clara, he nodded. "Yes, Ethan has spoken quite a bit about you. In fact, he hasn't stopped talking about your kindness since that evening." There was a note of gratitude in his tone, but also curiosity, as if he were trying to piece together why someone like Clara would go out of their way for a stranger. Clara felt her cheeks flush under his scrutiny, but she shrugged modestly. "I didn't do anything special," she insisted, "just tried to make sure he got home safely." "That's more than most people would have done," Alexander replied, his words carrying a weight that suggested he knew exactly how rare such selflessness was. He paused, studying her carefully before continuing. "May we sit for a moment? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Clara hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where her coworkers were busy preparing orders. Normally, she wouldn't dream of taking time away from her duties, but there was something compelling about the way Alexander spoke. Calm, direct, and impossible to refuse. "Of course," she said finally, gesturing to a nearby booth. "Please have a seat." As they settled into the vinyl-covered bench seats, Ethan grinned up at Clara, clearly thrilled to see her again. "I told you my dad would want to meet you," he declared proudly, as though introducing her to his father was some kind of personal victory. Clara smiled back, touched by his enthusiasm, but her attention quickly shifted to Alexander, who leaned forward with an intensity that demanded focus. "I'll get straight to the point," he began, cutting through any pretense. "Ethan mentioned how much your kindness meant to him that night, and how much it continues to mean. It's rare to find someone who genuinely cares about others without expecting anything in return. That quality, it's invaluable." Clara blinked, unsure where this conversation was headed. Was he complimenting her? Thanking her? She opened her mouth to respond, but Alexander held up a hand, silencing her before she could speak. "Let me finish," he said firmly. "I run a large company, as I'm sure you're aware. Part of my responsibility is ensuring that our success benefits more than just shareholders. It should extend to the communities we serve. Recently, I've been searching for someone to lead our charitable initiatives, someone with the right values and perspective to make a real impact." He paused, letting his words sink in. Clara stared at him, her mind racing. Surely he wasn't suggesting what she thought he was suggesting. Someone like her, a struggling waitress with no formal education beyond high school, couldn't possibly fit into his world. Could she? Alexander must have noticed her skepticism because he continued, his tone softer now. "You might be wondering why I'm telling you this. The truth is, Clara, I believe you could bring something unique to the table. Your compassion, your resilience, your ability to connect with people, those are qualities money can't buy. They're exactly what we need." Clara swallowed hard, her thoughts swirling. On one hand, the idea was absurd. How could she, someone who barely had time to sleep, step into a role like that? But on the other hand, the possibilities shimmered, tantalizingly in front of her. If she accepted, she could help people on a scale she'd never imagined. She could secure a better future for Danny, ensure he received the medical care he needed, and maybe even give herself a chance to breathe for once. But doubt lingered. "Mr. Hartwell," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I appreciate the offer, truly. But I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like this. I don't have experience running programs or managing teams. I'm just me." To her surprise, Alexander smiled faintly, as though he'd anticipated her objection. "Qualifications can be learned," he countered. "What can't be taught is empathy, and that's something you clearly have in abundance. Besides," he added, glancing at Ethan, who was watching the exchange with rapt attention, "you already have one very important endorsement." Ethan beamed at the mention, nodding vigorously. "She's amazing, Dad. You should hire her." Clara couldn't help but laugh at his earnestness, the tension easing slightly. Still, the decision weighed heavily on her shoulders. Accepting would mean stepping into an entirely new world, one she wasn't sure she belonged in. Rejecting the offer, however, felt equally daunting. Not only would it close a door she might never have the opportunity to open again, but it would also mean walking away from the chance to create meaningful change. After a long pause, Clara took a deep breath. "Can I think about it?" she asked tentatively. "This is a lot to process." "Of course," Alexander replied immediately, his demeanor calm and understanding. "Take all the time you need. I realize this isn't a decision to be made lightly." For the rest of the day, Clara found it difficult to concentrate. Her mind kept drifting back to the conversation, replaying Alexander's words over and over again. What would it be like to work for someone like him? To leave behind the diner and enter a realm where her efforts could touch thousands of lives, instead of just a handful? The thought was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. That evening, as she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the napkin with her hastily scribbled phone number still tucked safely in her pocket, Clara realized something. Helping Ethan that night hadn't just changed his life, it had set hers on a path she never could have predicted. Whether or not she accepted Alexander's offer, one thing was certain. Sometimes acts of kindness ripple outward in ways we can't foresee, shaping destinies far beyond our own. The days following Alexander Hartwell's unexpected visit to the diner felt surreal for Clara. She replayed their conversation in her mind repeatedly, dissecting every word, every gesture, as if trying to uncover hidden meanings she might have missed. It wasn't just the enormity of his offer that left her unsettled. It was the realization that this decision could alter the course of her life forever. For someone who had spent years focusing solely on survival, the idea of stepping into a completely unfamiliar world filled her with both excitement and dread. To make matters worse, Danny noticed the change in her demeanor almost immediately. "You've been acting weird," he said one evening as they sat together at their tiny kitchen table, sharing a simple dinner of spaghetti and canned sauce. His voice carried a mix of concern and curiosity, his youthful face scrunching up as he studied her. "What's going on?" Clara hesitated, stirring her fork absently in her plate. She hadn't told him about Alexander's offer yet, unsure of how to explain something she barely understood herself. But keeping secrets from Danny had never been easy. He had a way of reading her like an open book. Finally, after a long pause, she sighed and set her fork down. "Okay, fine," she admitted, leaning back in her chair. "Something happened at work the other day. Something big." Danny's eyes lit up instantly. "Big? Like what?" He pressed eagerly, abandoning his meal entirely. Clara chuckled despite herself. "Well, remember that boy I told you about? The one I met during that snowstorm? Ethan?" Danny nodded enthusiastically. He loved hearing stories about Clara's encounters at the diner, especially when they involved acts of kindness. To him, his sister was a real-life superhero, always looking out for others even when she had so little to give. "Well," Clara continued, choosing her words carefully, "it turns out Ethan's dad is, well, he's kind of a big deal, like really rich, and he wants to hire me to help run charity programs for his company." For a moment, Danny simply stared at her, his mouth hanging slightly open. Then, breaking into a wide grin, he exclaimed, "That's awesome, you should totally do it. Imagine all the cool stuff you'll get to do." Clara smiled faintly but shook her head. "It's not that simple, kiddo. This isn't just some regular job, it's a whole different world, a world I don't know anything about. What if I mess it up? What if I embarrass myself? Or worse, let people down?" Danny frowned, clearly confused by her hesitation. "But you're amazing, Clara. Everyone knows that. Why would you think you'd fail?" His unwavering faith in her tugged at her heartstrings, but it also made her feel guilty. How could she explain to him that self-doubt wasn't something you could simply brush aside? That no matter how much confidence others placed in her, the fear of failure still lingered. Over the next few days, Clara wrestled with her decision, weighing the pros and cons until her head spun. On one hand, accepting Alexander's offer meant stability, not just for her, but for Danny too. With a steady income and access to better resources, she could finally ensure he received the medical care he needed without constantly worrying about bills. Plus, the opportunity to help others on such a large scale was undeniably appealing. It aligned perfectly with her values, giving her a chance to amplify the impact of her kindness far beyond the walls of the diner. On the other hand, the thought of stepping into Alexander's elite circle terrified her. She pictured boardroom meetings, formal events, and interactions with people who spoke languages she didn't understand. Languages of wealth, privilege, and power. How would she ever fit in? Would she be judged for her lack of education? Her modest background, her worn-out shoes? The uncertainty gnawed at her, planting seeds of doubt that threatened to overshadow her excitement. One afternoon, while taking a rare break between shifts at the diner, Clara decided to call Ethan. She hadn't spoken to him since the night she walked him home, and something about hearing his voice might help clarify her thoughts. Picking up her phone, she dialed the number he'd given her, half expecting it to go unanswered. To her surprise, Ethan picked up almost immediately. "Clara," he exclaimed, his tone brightening instantly. "I was hoping you'd call." Hearing his enthusiasm brought an involuntary smile to her face. "Hey, Ethan," she replied warmly. "How are you doing?" "I'm good," he chirped. "Dad says we're going to take a trip soon, maybe somewhere warm. But I wanted to ask you something first." "Oh, yeah?" Clara prompted, intrigued. "What's that?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, as though Ethan were gathering his courage. "Do you think you'll say yes to my dad's offer?" he asked finally, his voice tinged with both hope and nervousness. "Because I really, really want you to." Clara's breath hitched. She hadn't expected him to bring it up, let alone sound so invested in her decision. "Ethan," she began gently, "this is a big choice for me. It's not just about saying yes or no, it's about figuring out if I'm ready for something like this." "But you'd be perfect," Ethan insisted, his conviction unwavering. "You're nice and smart, and you care about people. Dad needs someone like that. I need someone like that." Her chest tightened at his words. In that moment, she realized how much her answer mattered. Not just to her or Alexander, but to Ethan too. He saw her as a source of comfort, of connection, in a life otherwise dominated by loneliness and detachment. Turning him down would mean letting him down, and that was something she couldn't bear. After hanging up with Ethan, Clara spent the rest of the day lost in thought. By the time her shift ended, she found herself walking aimlessly through the quiet streets, her mind racing. Eventually, she found herself standing outside the diner, staring up at its flickering neon sign. This place had been her refuge for years, a constant in a life full of uncertainties. Leaving it behind would feel like losing a piece of herself, but staying meant turning away from an opportunity that might never come again. As she stood there, a memory surfaced, one she hadn't thought about in years. When she was younger, her mother used to tell her a story about a bird trapped in a cage. The bird longed to fly free, but it was afraid of the vast sky beyond the bars. One day, the door to the cage opened, and though the bird hesitated, it eventually spread its wings and soared. Her mother's lesson was simple. Sometimes fear holds us back from reaching our true potential. We have to trust ourselves to take the leap. Taking a deep breath, Clara pulled out her phone and dialed Alexander's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and composed. "Miss Clara," he greeted her. "Have you had time to consider my offer?" "Yes," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "And I've decided I'd like to accept." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a soft chuckle. "I'm glad to hear that," Alexander said, genuine warmth seeping into his tone. "You won't regret this, Clara. I promise." As she hung up the phone, a wave of emotions washed over her. Excitement, apprehension, and a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't just surviving but thriving, where her kindness could reach countless lives, and where she could finally give Danny the life he deserved. Little did she know, this decision would lead her not only to professional success, but also to a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to belong, to find family in unexpected places and discover strength in vulnerability. As Clara walked home under the starlit sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change, for the better. Clara's first day at Hartwell Enterprises felt like stepping into another universe. The sleek glass and steel building loomed high above the city streets, its polished exterior reflecting the morning sun in dazzling bursts of light. As she approached the entrance, her heart raced with a mix of excitement and anxiety. She had spent the past week preparing, reading articles about Alexander Hartwell, researching the company's charitable initiatives, even practicing how to tie her hair in a way that looked more professional. Yet nothing could have fully prepared her for the reality of walking into this world. Inside, the lobby was a masterpiece of modern design. Marble floors gleamed beneath her feet, abstract art adorned the walls, and a reception desk made of smooth black stone seemed almost too pristine to touch. Clara glanced down at her outfit, a modest blouse and tailored trousers she'd borrowed from a neighbor, and hoped it would suffice. Despite her nerves, she reminded herself why she was here. Not for the glamour or prestige, but to make a difference. That thought gave her the courage to step forward and introduce herself to the receptionist. "Hi, I'm Clara," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies fluttering in her stomach. "I'm here to meet Mr. Hartwell." The receptionist nodded politely, picking up the phone to announce her arrival. Within moments, a familiar figure emerged from the elevators, an impeccably dressed Alexander Hartwell, his presence commanding, yet approachable. "Clara," he greeted her warmly, extending a hand. "Welcome aboard." His words were simple, but they carried weight, as though sealing an unspoken agreement between them. Clara shook his hand firmly, forcing herself to smile despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. "Thank you for having me," she replied, her tone sincere. As they stepped into the elevator together, Clara couldn't help but marvel at the contrast between this moment and her life just weeks earlier. Back then, she had been serving coffee and wiping down tables, her biggest concern whether she'd earn enough tips to cover rent. Now she was riding alongside one of the most influential men in the world, about to embark on a journey that promised to reshape not only her own future, but countless others. Alexander led her to a spacious office on the top floor, its floor-to-ceiling, windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. "This will be your workspace," he explained, gesturing toward a sleek desk equipped with a state-of-the-art computer and ergonomic chair. "We've already set up everything you'll need to get started. My assistant will brief you on our ongoing projects later today, but first, let's talk about your role." He motioned for her to sit, taking a seat across from her. For a man of his stature, he had an uncanny ability to put people at ease, speaking plainly without condescension. "Your primary responsibility will be overseeing our charitable initiatives," he continued. "You'll work closely with various teams to identify areas where we can make the greatest impact, from education programs for underprivileged children to healthcare access for marginalized communities. But beyond that, I want you to bring your perspective to the table, your experiences, your values. They're exactly what we need to keep these efforts grounded and meaningful." Clara listened intently, nodding as he spoke. Each word reinforced her belief that this opportunity wasn't just about climbing a corporate ladder, it was about creating real change. Still, she couldn't shake the nagging question lingering in the back of her mind. "Mr. Hartwell," she began hesitantly, "what if I mess up? What if I don't live up to your expectations?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her thoughtfully before responding. "Let me tell you something, Clara," he said, his tone earnest. "No one expects perfection, not even me. What matters is your willingness to learn, adapt, and grow. You've already proven yourself capable of empathy and leadership. Those qualities are far rarer than technical skills, which can always be taught. Trust yourself, and trust the process. That's all anyone can ask of you." His reassurance eased some of her fears, though not entirely. It would take time, she knew, to feel truly comfortable in this new environment. But for now, she resolved to focus on the task ahead, rather than dwell on doubts. Over the next few days, Clara immersed herself in her new role, attending meetings, reviewing project proposals, and collaborating with colleagues who initially intimidated her with their polished demeanors and encyclopedic knowledge. At first, she worried about being out of place, afraid her lack of formal education might show. But to her surprise, people responded positively to her authenticity. Her questions, though sometimes basic, sparked thoughtful discussions, and her suggestions, rooted in first-hand experience, brought fresh perspectives to the table. One afternoon, while reviewing plans for a community center aimed at supporting low-income families, Clara found herself sitting across from Ethan. He had tagged, along with his father, to the office, eager to see her again. Seeing him there, surrounded by executives and paperwork, reminded her of why she had accepted this position in the first place. "You're really doing it," Ethan said proudly, watching as she highlighted key points in a document. "You're helping people." Clara smiled, setting down her pen. "Well, I'm trying," she admitted. "It's a lot harder than I thought it would be, but it's worth it." Ethan tilted his head curiously. "What's the hardest part?" She laughed softly, leaning back in her chair. "Honestly, feeling like I belong here. Everyone else seems so confident, like they know exactly what they're doing. Me? I'm still figuring things out as I go." "But you're good at it," Ethan insisted, his faith unwavering. "You care about people. That's what makes you special." His words struck a chord deep within her, reminding her of the lesson her mother once taught her about the bird in the cage. Belonging wasn't about fitting perfectly into someone else's mold. It was about spreading your wings and trusting yourself to fly. As the weeks turned into months, Clara grew increasingly comfortable in her role. She threw herself into every project, pouring her heart into initiatives that aligned with her values. Under her guidance, the company launched several successful programs, earning praise from both employees and beneficiaries alike. Her reputation as a compassionate and effective leader spread quickly, earning her respect even among those who had initially doubted her capabilities. But perhaps the most unexpected development was the bond she formed with Alexander and Ethan. Though their lives were vastly different from hers, they welcomed her into their world with open arms. Alexander treated her not as an employee but as a partner, valuing her input and encouraging her growth. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to seek her out whenever possible, sharing stories about school, asking for advice, and occasionally slipping comic book references into their conversations. In many ways, he became the little brother she never had, filling a void she hadn't realized existed until now. Through it all, Clara remained grounded, refusing to let the trappings of wealth and success overshadow her core values. She visited the diner regularly, checking in on old co-workers and ensuring she stayed connected to the life she had left behind. And whenever doubt crept in, she reminded herself of the same truth that had guided her since childhood. Kindness transcends boundaries, and true fulfillment comes not from what you have, but from what you give. By the end of her first year at Hartwell Enterprises, Clara had transformed not only the company's charitable efforts, but also her own understanding of purpose and belonging. What had started as a leap of faith had blossomed into something extraordinary, a testament to the power of resilience, compassion, and trust in oneself. Little did she know, however, that her journey was far from over. New challenges and opportunities awaited, ready to push her even further beyond her comfort zone. As the months stretched into years, Clara's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. Her role at Hartwell Enterprises had grown far beyond overseeing charitable initiatives. She had become a driving force behind the company's mission to create meaningful change. Under her leadership, entire communities were uplifted. Schools were built in underserved areas, medical clinics opened their doors to those without access to health care, and mentorship programs gave children a chance to dream bigger than their circumstances allowed. Yet, despite her professional success, what truly defined Clara's journey was the profound impact she had on the people around her. Not just the beneficiaries of her work, but those closest to her as well. Alexander Hartwell, once a distant figure known only through headlines and boardroom meetings, had evolved into something resembling family. Their relationship wasn't one of employer and employee. It was deeper, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. He admired Clara's unwavering dedication and her ability to connect with others on a human level, qualities he realized his own life had lacked for far too long. In turn, Clara came to see Alexander not as the untouchable billionaire everyone else idolized, but as a man striving to be better, for himself, for Ethan, and for the world around him. Ethan, now older and more confident, thrived under Clara's influence. Where once he had been a lonely boy yearning for attention, he blossomed into a compassionate young teenager who understood the value of kindness and humility. Clara became the maternal figure he had always needed, teaching him lessons that went far beyond textbooks or business strategies. She showed him how to find joy in small moments, how to listen when others spoke, and how to use his privilege to make a difference. On weekends, they often spent time together, volunteering at shelters or organizing fundraisers, laughing and learning side by side. For Ethan, Clara wasn't just a mentor. She was family. But Clara's transformation extended beyond her relationships with Alexander and Ethan. It reached into her personal life, reshaping the bond she shared with Danny. With financial stability finally within reach, Danny received the medical care he desperately needed, allowing him to regain his strength and pursue his own dreams. The siblings grew closer than ever, their connection fortified by years of hardship overcome together. Danny often joked that Clara was his real-life superhero, though she would laugh it off, insisting that they had saved each other in equal measure. Despite all the changes, however, Clara remained steadfastly grounded. She refused to let wealth or recognition alter who she was at her core. Every Friday evening, no matter how busy her schedule, she returned to the diner where it all began. Sitting at her favorite corner table, sipping coffee and chatting with old coworkers, she reminded herself of the importance of staying connected to her roots. Those visits kept her humble, reminding her that success wasn't measured by titles or bank accounts. It was measured by the lives you touched along the way. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled outside her office window, Clara found herself reflecting on just how far she had come. She thought back to that snowy night when she had first met Ethan, unaware that helping him would set her on a path towards such extraordinary change. At the time, she had acted out of instinct, driven by compassion rather than expectation. And, yet looking back, she realized that moment had been pivotal, not just for her but for everyone involved. That evening, Alexander invited Clara to join him and Ethan for dinner at their penthouse. It wasn't an unusual request. Over the years, these gatherings had become a cherished tradition, a chance for them to reconnect away from the pressures of work and school. But this particular evening felt different. As Clara stepped inside the luxurious apartment, she noticed a quiet anticipation in the air. Alexander greeted her warmly while Ethan bounced excitedly beside him, barely able to contain his enthusiasm. Once they were seated around the dining table, illuminated by the soft glow of candles, Alexander cleared his throat. "Clara," he began, his tone unusually serious, "there's something I've been meaning to say for a while now." Clara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, what is it?" Alexander exchanged a glance with Ethan before continuing. "You've done incredible things here, not just for the company, but for us personally. You've shown Ethan what true kindness looks like, and you've reminded me of the values I sometimes lose sight of in this fast-paced world." He paused, his gaze steady. "I want you to know that you're more than just a colleague to us. You're part of our family." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes, though she blinked them away quickly, unwilling to let them fall. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you'll ever know." Ethan chimed in eagerly, his face lighting up. "And we have a surprise for you." Reaching under the table, he pulled out a framed photograph. It was a picture of the three of them taken during one of their volunteer outings, a candid shot, capturing laughter and camaraderie. Beneath it, engraved on a silver plaque, were the words, "Family isn't always blood." Clara stared at the gift, her heart swelling with gratitude. She didn't need expensive trinkets or grand gestures to feel valued. This simple acknowledgement of their bond meant everything to her. Setting the frame down gently, she smiled at them both. "I don't know what I did to deserve you two," she said softly, "but I'm so glad I found you." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter and conversation, each moment reinforcing the unbreakable ties they had formed. As Clara left the penthouse later that night, stepping out into the cool autumn air, she felt a deep sense of contentment wash over her. Life hadn't turned out the way she had planned. It had exceeded her wildest dreams. Through acts of kindness, resilience, and trust, she had built a future filled with purpose, love, and belonging. In the end, Clara's story wasn't about wealth or status. It was about the power of connection. It was about finding beauty in unexpected places and discovering that true richness lies not in material possessions, but in the relationships we nurture and the lives we touch. And as she walked home beneath a sky sprinkled with stars, Clara knew one thing for certain. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the potential to ripple outward, shaping destinies far beyond our own.